going to have a look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and chapter 20. So at this point in the novel, Victor has been moved by the creature's loneliness and decided to create a female companion for him. We're never really sure what he's been doing, but we assume that he's been collecting body parts and assembling this female, rather like he did the creature himself. He begins to have second thoughts just as he's finished. And what crystallizes these second thoughts is he sees the monster at the window grinning like a demon. And it's that tips him over the edge. And he resolves to destroy the female creature, and he tears her body to pieces. And the monster is furious and so vows to seek his revenge on Victor on his wedding night. So what I've done in the next two slides is I've got the section that I'm referring to here on these two slides. So you might want to pause the PowerPoint at this particular moment and just read this section for a few minutes. So now you've read that passage again, you'd probably be able to spot that Shelley's methods here are quite typically Gothic. Let's have a look at the setting for a start. It is we come to see it now as quite a cliched setting. This isolation, the moon's out, it's dark, we're in a laboratory in the middle of nowhere. So it's a perfect setting of kind of horror and terror, where almost anything can happen. And so that is, of course, typically Gothic. And then also look at the narrative style. You'll have noticed, and maybe you'll have grown tired actually of this style as you were reading, I don't know, but it's quite hyperbolic, isn't it? It's very melodramatic, it's full of exaggeration. And that is typically a part of Gothic literature, which is designed to sort of create a world that feels far away from everyday life, that feels fantastical, so that almost we could believe this is a place where almost anything could happen. And so you might want to mention aspects of the style that's sort of melodramatic and hyperbolic and so on. And of course the main theme of this is sort of this battle between good and evil. But who is the good figure and who is the evil figure? So we have this protagonist antagonist thing going on in this novel, in that we're never really quite sure who we're rooting for, and Shelley manipulates the reader's response to both Victor and the monster throughout her text. Let's have a look at the character of Victor here. Victor's really a bit of an anti-hero. His obsession with finding the elixir of life, his obsession with science is presented as something as, unnatural. And in this text, Victor talks about his unremitting attention to his labour. Shutting himself away from society, that's bad. And he's very much in the kind of like male domain of science, whereas the women, and you'll have noted this from other videos, that the women are very much in the domestic sphere. So his science is seen as something very much a part of the public sphere. And of course, what motivates Victor is this: he wants this public recognition of the success of his scientific creation. That's really what drives him. He's very ambitious. He's the archetypal overreacher. If you have a look at the subtitle of the novel, it's called A Modern Prometheus. So we can see that Victor here, rather like Prometheus, overreaches himself. He goes beyond the bounds of what's acceptable. He plays God, and he steals the secret of life from nature, and therefore must be punished for it. So in effect, he opposes nature. He is an antagonist. Frankenstein's quest for knowledge, to find the sort of physical secrets of the world, is presented as unethical and downright dangerous. And it gets him in the end, of course, doesn't it? And contextually, there is this, I guess, a fear of scientific advancements and where that might lead as well. And we kind of get the feeling, even in this passage, that Victor, but of course elsewhere as well, is mentally sick. His isolation is unnatural and is damaging. And he talks about, in this passage, he talks about the sickening oppression of most terrible reveries. So in other words, the dreams, he can't sleep at night. He's almost sick in the head. And of course, the way that he tears the female creature to pieces is kind of, mad, isn't it? And let's have a look at the character of the creature as well. Who are we rooting for? Does Shelley side with the creature or the creator? And I probably say that she sides with the creature. Victor's perspective, though, is very different. In chapter 20, he describes the ghastly grin on his wrinkled lips. He talks about the malice and the treachery, calls him a devil, and so on. So Victor sees the monster as, downright evil. But the reader gets another perspective. Up until this point, we have read all about the De Lacys, what happens when the creature stands outside the cottage, and he watches them and wants to be a part of that family. And when he's rejected by them, it's that causes this transformation. He becomes dehumanized by others. And Shelley gives the monster a voice. She makes him eloquent and articulate. She gives him a kind of a nobility that certainly makes him equal to the other human beings in a story, if not superior to them. And look at this particular passage. The creature says, "Shall each man find a wife for his bosom, each beast have his mate, and I be alone?" I mean, it's a fair point, isn't it? "I had feelings of affection, and they were requited by detestation and scorn." So Shelley presents Victor's rejection of him and society's rejection of him as being to blame for the monster's violence. And we've got this parallel here, I think, with Elizabeth as well. Don't forget that Elizabeth was abandoned by her parents, and yet she was treated with kindness. She was adopted by Victor's family and adored, and whilst the monster was rejected. And so we have a kind of a parallel there with Elizabeth's story. And Shelley's wider meaning with this novel is that it's really how do we treat outsiders? And we must treat them with respect. And we've got the background, of course, of the legalization of the abolition of slavery here as well, the sort of 1780s, and that might have affected Shelley's response as well to the way people who are marginalised in society might be treated. And the monster's repulsive appearance as well. Some critics have thought that that's a possible indicator of the moral ugliness of Victor's actions as well. So I've talked about Victor and I've talked about the monster, but where are the women in all of this? How do we link this to a feminist perspective? Well, there are different ways that we might see Shelley's meaning in her novel. One view might be that what Shelley's doing with Frankenstein is it's a critique of society. She's championing the rights of the oppressed and the powerless through the way that she characterises the creature. And that makes sense. And we've got the background of the unsettling background of the French Revolution. We've got the abolition of slavery. And, all those things kind of feed into the way Shelley might present the marginalised in society. We also might see the novel as a warning about the dangers of meddling with science. But Anne Meller and, there are other feminist writers, Ellen Moores, for example, when she writes her book, The Female Gothic, they all have interesting perspectives on what Shelley might be doing here. And it's for you to weigh up as to whether this makes sense or not. Is this convenient overthinking of a feminist, or is it a valid argument? We have a look at who Mary Shelley is, who her mother was. She was an early feminist. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was part of the Romantic movement. They were kind of liberal, free thinkers and so on. So it might make sense then that she is criticising this sort of patriarchal world that is presented in her novel. So Anne Meller, she talks about how Victor participates in a gendered construction of the universe. In other words, a very kind of like, women do this and, men do that, and that's their role and nothing should change. And she says how females are presented as passive and possessible. And you've only got to look at the way that Elizabeth is characterised to understand that totally does make sense, how she's presented as a pretty present for Victor. And, she's this kind of like self-sacrificing angel in the way that she is a caregiver and so on. Victor's mother, of course, as well, has that same role. So Anne Meller talks about how what Victor is essentially doing in this novel is he is participating in the destruction of the female. Victor is usurping the woman's role in reproduction by creating life himself. That's a woman's job. Eliminating the need for women in society. And what Anne Meller thinks is that the novel shows us the consequences of a society that values men over women. She talks particularly about the separation of the two spheres, the female in the domestic sphere, the male in the public sphere. And this causes Frankenstein's downfall, the way that he only has time only makes time in his life for his studies, for science, and kind of blocks out his family and his and Elizabeth. So he can't work and love at the same time. He fails to feel empathy for the creature, and that's dangerous, the separation of these two spheres. She goes on to describe, Anne Meller goes on to describe how Mary Shelley's novel is like a political attack on a society founded on patriarchy and the unequal distribution of power and possessions. So it's one perspective, and you can look into that, but I think that there's definitely some evidence for that. Let's have a look at why Victor destroys the female monster. Anne Meller says that he's afraid of an independent female. He's afraid that she'll have desires, this new creature that he's created, that she'll have desires and opinions that can't be controlled. Anne Meller says that she might Victor's worried that this creature might appear to have her own integrity and assert her revolutionary right to determine her own existence. And so there's some valid arguments with this. If we look closely at the passage that I've asked you to look at, Victor does say that this creature that he's created, she might become 10,000 more malignant than her mate and delight in murder and wretchedness. She, who in all probability would become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with a compact made before her creation. She also might turn with disgust from him, from the creature the male creature that he created, to the superior beauty of man. She might quit him, and that he fears that her this female might then ultimately, if she is liberated into the world and thinks for herself, she might threaten the very existence of the whole human race. So I've just quoted bits from that first section of the passage that I've asked you to look at. But so there is definitely some mileage in what Anne Mellor says, and that's just something for you to think about yourself. But her argument basically is about how Victor truly fears female sexuality, and it's all based around those ideas about kind of she believes that Mary Shelley, this is a massive kind of feminist statement that she's making in her novel. So you've got to weigh it up. Is she simply just writing a brilliant horror story? Is she simply just talking about how we treat outsiders, championing their rights, giving them a voice? Is she presenting a warning about science, or is it this kind of big feminist statement underlying her text? And that's just something that you've just got to work out for yourselves.